The challenge is often described as new, a rising nation, a shifting balance, a moment of transition. But what unsettles people is not novelty. It is recognition, the feeling that something long buried has returned, not as a replica, but as an echo. When observers say that China challenges the United States, the unease rarely comes from policy or trade or technology alone. It comes from the sense that a historical wound has reopened, one that never fully healed, only quieted with time. This episode examines that quiet recurrence, not as a contest of dominance, and not as a story of winners and losers, but as a pattern that appears whenever civilizations believe time is on their side. A pattern shaped less by strategy than by memory, belief, and the human tendency to mistake pauses for endings. The inquiry is not about who is right. It is about why certain moments feel familiar, even when the world looks different. Why the present sometimes feels older than the past. Across long stretches of history, civilizations do not simply rise and fall. They remember, they store narratives about who they were, what they lost, and what was taken from them. These narratives do not fade evenly. They compress, they wait, and when conditions allow, they resurface with renewed intensity, often framed as destiny rather than choice. China's modern posture cannot be separated from this longer rhythm, nor can America's reaction. But the pattern does not belong to either alone. It belongs to the way societies carry time within themselves. For centuries, China understood itself as continuous rather than progressive. Dynasties changed, borders shifted, but the underlying sense of civilizational endurance remained intact. Time was cyclical, not linear. Order decayed, chaos followed, and order returned again. Decline was not an end. It was a phase. This belief shaped expectations. It framed patience as virtue and endurance as inevitability. Then came interruption, not just defeat, but disorientation. A sudden confrontation with a world that operated on different assumptions about speed, expansion, and finality. The memory of that rupture did not disappear when conditions improved. It settled into collective consciousness as unfinished business. A wound not defined by a single event, but by the realization that continuity itself could be broken. On the other side of the world, a different rhythm took hold. America's story emphasized beginnings, a break from old cycles, a belief that history could be escaped through design. Progress was not repetition, but ascent. Each generation was expected to move forward, not return. Memory mattered, but only as a warning against regression, not as a guide back to something lost. For a long time, these two temporal instincts did not collide directly. Distance, circumstance, and distraction kept them apart. When they did interact, it was often interpreted through surface explanations, economics, alliances, rivalry. But beneath those explanations, something quieter was forming, a shared misreading of time. One side assumed that the arc bent naturally toward its own model, that others would eventually align with it. The other assumed that history was correcting itself, returning to an older equilibrium that had merely been interrupted. Both assumptions relied on inevitability. Both reduced uncertainty by turning the future into a familiar shape. This is where the pattern begins to tighten. Ancient traditions often warn against confusing stability with permanence. When conditions remain favorable for long enough, restraint erodes. Confidence becomes belief. Belief hardens into identity. And identity resists revision, even when circumstances change. The challenge does not emerge at the moment of imbalance. It emerges later, when narratives lag behind reality. When societies continue to act as though yesterday's assumptions are still intact. At that point, even small shifts feel existential. Not because they are unprecedented, but because they threaten the story people tell themselves about where they stand in time. In this sense, the reopening of a wound is not an act of aggression. It is an act of memory. a resurfacing of unresolved meaning. The past does not return as it was. It returns altered, compressed, and often moralized. Ancient texts describe cycles where dominance breeds complacency and recovery breeds urgency. But they also describe something subtler, the danger of mistaking one's internal sense of time for universal truth. When civilizations project their temporal assumptions outward, misunderstanding becomes inevitable. America's confidence in forward motion created a quiet expectation that challenges would be transitional, temporary friction on a longer path. China's confidence in recurrence created an expectation that disruption would eventually give way to restoration. Neither expectation was irrational. Both were incomplete. As conditions shifted, interpretation lagged. Actions were read not as adjustments, but as signals. Each side began to see intention where there was also inheritance, strategy where there was memory, threat where there was repetition. This is not unique. Similar moments appear throughout history. A rising force framed as resurgence rather than innovation. A dominant force framed as guardian rather than participant. Each sees itself as acting in alignment with time, while the other appears out of step. Ancient wisdom rarely condemns ambition outright. It questions timing. It asks whether movement arises from necessity or from narrative momentum, whether restraint is still possible once a story has taken hold. What makes this moment feel volatile is not the scale of interaction, but the synchronization of belief. Both sides perceive themselves as responding, not initiating. Both view their position as corrective rather than disruptive. In such conditions, escalation does not require intention. It emerges from mirrored certainty. And beneath that certainty is a shared discomfort with uncertainty itself. Civilizations, like individuals, struggle with ambiguity. They seek coherence. They prefer stories where meaning is clear and direction is justified. When the present becomes ambiguous, the past offers templates. Old wounds become explanations. Old triumphs become expectations. But repetition is never exact. Each cycle introduces distortion. What once guided now misleads. What once protected now provokes. Ancient patterns repeat, not because people fail to learn, but because they learn selectively. They remember what confirms identity and forget what complicates it. This is why the language of challenge feels moralized, why economic shifts are read as intention, why technological change is interpreted as destiny. The deeper issue is not competition. It is the fear that one's place in the cycle is misunderstood, or worse, ending. Here the inquiry turns inward. When we feel challenged, how often is it because something external has changed? And how often because our internal timeline no longer matches reality? When does memory sharpen perception, and when does it narrow it? And how easily do we mistake recurrence for inevitability, simply because it feels familiar? Ancient thinkers warned that the most dangerous moment is not collapse, but confidence during transition. When signs are interpreted through inherited belief rather than present conditions. When restraint feels like delay and patience feels like weakness. At that point, even wisdom becomes difficult to hear because it threatens the story already in motion. The reopening of a wound suggests that it was never fully examined, only covered. Time passed, but meaning did not settle. Now the surface has shifted again, and the old questions reappear, carrying new weight. Perhaps the unease surrounding this moment is not about who will prevail, but about whether anyone is willing to loosen their grip on inherited certainty. Whether cycles can be recognized without being reenacted. Whether repetition can be observed without being obeyed. History does not insist on recurrence. It offers it as a possibility. The choice to repeat is quieter. It happens when belief outruns awareness, and when identity resists uncertainty. The wound reopens not because it must, but because it was never allowed to close in understanding. And until that changes, the past will continue to arrive disguised as the future, asking the same questions in a different voice. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.